When a man like Hugh Laurie speaks about the actors who shaped him, it isn't nostalgia, it's a quiet reckoning with time, craft, and the people who taught him how to listen. Born in 1959, Hugh Laurie came of age in an era that prized discipline over spectacle and depth over speed. So when Laurie, at 66, finally named the actors who mattered most to him, it wasn't a list at all. It was a lifetime of observation, distilled into 6 names. The first name Hugh Laurie speaks with a kind of reverent certainty is Peter O'Toole. Not because O'Toole was flawless, but because he was fearless. Laurie encountered him the way many of his generation did on a screen that seemed barely large enough to contain him. O'Toole did not arrive quietly. He burned. In Laurence of Arabia, in The Ruling Class, in performances that felt less like acting and more like exposure, O'Toole showed what it meant to risk everything in front of an audience. What Laurie admired most was not technique alone, but danger. O'Toole had a way of standing still and making silence feel volatile. He didn't rush moments, he trusted them. Laurie once reflected that O'Toole could do almost nothing and still command the entire room, a skill that cannot be taught, only earned through courage. To watch him was to feel that something might go wrong at any second, and that was precisely the point. There was also imperfection, and Laurie noticed that too. O'Toole was unpredictable, sometimes excessive, sometimes raw to the point of discomfort. But for Laurie, that volatility was honesty. It reminded him that acting was not about polish or safety. It was about presence, about standing on a metaphorical tightrope without rehearsing the fall. O'Toole didn't protect the audience from himself, he invited them into the risk. That lesson stayed with Laurie. Years later, when he played Gregory House, a character defined by stillness, pauses, and withheld emotion, you can hear echoes of O'Toole's restraint. Not imitation, but inheritance. Laurie learned that you don't need volume to create intensity. You need commitment. You need the nerve to let silence speak. O'Toole also embodied something else Laurie respected deeply: refusal to repeat himself. Each performance felt newly discovered, even when the cost was inconsistency. Laurie understood that choice. In a profession that rewards familiarity, O'Toole chose uncertainty. He treated acting not as a career path, but as an ongoing confrontation with truth. For viewers who remember seeing O'Toole for the first time, perhaps late at night, television glowing softly in a quiet room, you remember that feeling too. The sense that this wasn't entertainment. It was a man testing how far presence alone could go. For Hugh Laurie, Peter O'Toole didn't just redefine acting, he defined courage. The second name on Hugh Laurie's list carries a different kind of weight. Where Peter O'Toole represented risk and volatility, Laurence Olivier represented control, mastery. The idea that acting at its highest level could be constructed with almost architectural precision. For Laurie, Olivier was not merely an influence, he was a benchmark. Laurie encountered Olivier first, as many British actors of his generation did, not as a contemporary, but as a looming standard. Olivier belonged to an older world, one shaped by theater, diction, and physical command. His performances did not ask permission, they declared intent, whether on stage or screen. Olivier arrived already in possession of the space. Laurie once described him as an actor who never seemed to wonder if he belonged there. He simply did. What Laurie admired most was Olivier's absolute authority over his craft. Every movement was deliberate, every pause chosen. Watching Olivier perform Richard III was, for Laurie, less a lesson in realism and more a lesson in dominance. Olivier did not disappear into roles. He shaped them around his own formidable presence. It was theatrical, unapologetically so, and yet never false. That balance fascinated Laurie. There was also tension beneath the control. Laurie sensed it. Olivier's performances often carried the energy of a man fighting to hold something together. That struggle, Laurie believed, was the engine of Olivier's power. He acted as though the role could be taken from him at any moment, as though excellence were not a given, but a demand renewed every night. That urgency made even his most polished work feel alive. For Laurie, Olivier represented the disciplined side of acting, the understanding that craft requires rigor, that preparation is not the enemy of emotion, but its foundation. When Laurie later moved between comedy and drama, between absurdity and gravity, Olivier's influence surfaced in his precision. Even at his most understated, Laurie's performances were structured, intentional, nothing accidental. That lesson came straight from Olivier. If you grew up watching Olivier, you remember the authority in his voice, the way he seemed to stand taller than the frame allowed. Laurie saw that too, and he understood that greatness did not always need to be subtle. Sometimes it needed to be unmistakable. The third name on Laurie's list marks a shift in energy, tone, and emotional temperature: Robin Williams. Where Olivier was measured, Williams was velocity. And Hugh Laurie never tried to compete with that. He knew better. Laurie first encountered Robin Williams the way most of the world did, as an overwhelming presence. Williams didn't enter scenes, he flooded them. His mind moved faster than language, faster than expectation. To Laurie, watching Williams felt like standing inside a storm, exhilarating, exhausting, and impossible to predict. But what held Laurie's attention wasn't the speed. It was the precision beneath it. Williams, for all his improvisation, never lost the emotional center of a character. In Dead Poets Society in Good Will Hunting, Laurie saw something rare, a man capable of reaching enormous emotional depths without announcing the descent. The humor wasn't decoration, it was armor. Laurie noticed the silences. The moments when Williams paused just long enough for something heavier to surface. Pain, longing, reflection. He once remarked that Williams could shift the emotional weight of a scene with a single breath. That kind of control, hidden beneath apparent chaos, impressed Laurie deeply. What Williams taught Laurie was not how to be louder or faster, but how to be truthful even at high velocity. That comedy and tragedy were not opposites, but neighbors. That laughter could coexist with sorrow, and often did. Laurie, whose own work would later balance sharp wit with quiet melancholy, absorbed that lesson fully. For an audience that remembers Williams not just as a performer but as a presence on late-night television, on film, in moments that felt spontaneous and unrepeatable, there is recognition here. Laurie saw what you saw, not just brilliance, but vulnerability. Robin Williams showed Hugh Laurie that emotional honesty didn't require restraint alone. Sometimes it required release, and knowing when to let go was as important as knowing when to hold back. The fourth name Hugh Laurie offers is spoken more quietly, almost inwardly: Colin Firth. Not a spectacle, not a force of nature, but something rarer, and in Laurie's eyes, more difficult to achieve: restraint. Laurie and Firth belong to the same generation, shaped by similar schools, similar traditions, and similar expectations of what a British actor should be. And yet, Laurie always sensed something different in Firth. On the surface, he fit the mold perfectly. Composed, elegant, classically handsome. But beneath that surface was a current of emotional precision that Laurie admired deeply. What struck Laurie most was Firth's ability to listen, truly listen. In performances like The King's Speech or A Single Man, Firth did not push emotion outward. He allowed it to gather, to accumulate, until the smallest gesture carried enormous weight. A hesitation, a glance, a breath taken too late. Laurie understood how much discipline that required, how much confidence. He once joked that Firth could say more with a blink than most actors could with a page of dialogue, but beneath the humor was respect. Laurie knew that kind of understatement demanded absolute control, not just of technique, but of ego. Firth never needed to dominate a scene to own it. He trusted the audience to meet him halfway. There was also versatility. Laurie watched Firth move from period drama to romantic comedy to psychological depth without losing credibility. That flexibility impressed him, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. Firth adapted without advertising the effort. He made transitions feel natural, inevitable. For Laurie, Firth represented the art of holding back. In a profession that often rewards excess, Firth showed that silence, when used well, could be louder than any monologue. That lesson stayed with Laurie, especially in later roles where stillness became his greatest tool. The fifth name on the list is personal: Emma Thompson. For Hugh Laurie, Thompson is not just an admired actor, but a shared history. They came up together long before fame settled their names into public memory, back when talent mattered more than reputation. Laurie has always loved language, but with Thompson, he saw someone who could wield it with devastating accuracy. She wasn't merely intelligent, she was emotionally exact, every word chosen, every pause intentional. Watching her perform was, for Laurie, a masterclass in timing. In Sense and Sensibility, Thompson broke hearts without raising her voice. In The Remains of the Day, she unraveled with such restraint that the damage felt almost unbearable. Laurie admired that courage, the willingness to trust subtlety, to let silence do the work. Off-screen, Thompson was just as formidable. Laurie has spoken about her sharp wit, her speed of thought, her refusal to soften herself for comfort. She didn't chase likability, she chased truth. And that, Laurie believed, is why her performances endured. Working alongside her pushed him, not through competition, but through standard. Thompson raised the bar simply by being present. Laurie once said that acting with her made you better because if you didn't rise to her level, you disappeared. For viewers who remember Thompson not just as a star, but as a voice of intelligence and emotional honesty, Laurie's admiration makes perfect sense. She represented everything he respected about the craft: fearlessness, precision, and integrity. Together, Firth and Thompson reflect something essential in Laurie's taste. Not volume, not vanity, but depth, control, and the quiet confidence to trust the audience with the truth. The sixth and final name Hugh Laurie offers is the one that feels closest to home: Stephen Fry. Not simply a collaborator, but a formative presence. Someone who didn't just influence Laurie's work, but helped shape the way he thought, spoke, and understood performance itself. Laurie and Fry emerged together, their early years intertwined through comedy, intellect, and a shared instinct for rhythm. Their partnership felt effortless to audiences, but Laurie knew it was built on something deeper: mutual understanding. Fry's mind moved quickly, expansively, drawing connections others missed. Laurie watched that with a mixture of admiration and humility. What Laurie respected most was Fry's courage. Not physical courage, but emotional exposure. Fry never hid behind cleverness, even though he had every reason to. He allowed vulnerability to live inside the humor. Pain, doubt, self-awareness all folded seamlessly into wit. Laurie once reflected that Fry could turn suffering into insight without diminishing either. On screen and off, Fry treated language as something alive. Words were not just vehicles for jokes, they were instruments of thought. Laurie absorbed that sensibility. You can hear it later in his performances: the careful phrasing, the musicality of speech, the understanding that meaning often lies between sentences, not inside them. Fry also taught Laurie that comedy and seriousness were not opposites. They were partners. That the sharpest laughter often comes from recognition, and the deepest sadness can be softened by intelligence. For Laurie, who would later balance humor with darkness in roles like House, that lesson proved invaluable. If you remember watching Laurie and Fry together, late-night television humming softly, laughter carrying just a trace of melancholy, you know exactly what he means. There was warmth there, and risk and honesty. Listening to these six names together, you begin to understand that Hugh Laurie wasn't naming favorites, he was naming principles. Courage from O'Toole, discipline from Olivier, emotional truth from Williams, restraint from Firth, precision from Thompson, bravery from Fry. At 66, Laurie's reflections reveal a man shaped not by applause, but by observation. He learned by watching, by listening, by allowing others to leave their mark without imitation. Decades on, Hugh Laurie still performs with that same quiet attentiveness. Because the best lessons, like the best performances, don't fade. They stay with you long after the curtain falls. Hugh Laurie's choices reflect an era when craft mattered more than noise, and greatness was measured not by visibility, but by depth and endurance. As Hugh Laurie once said, "The longer you do this, the more you realize it's not about being seen, it's about seeing clearly."